right, AP Psych, welcome to your first video notes, your first flip notes. Our first topic, what is psychology? The great thing about video notes is that you can pause them whenever you need to, and I encourage you to do that. I'm going to move through the slides and talk through some things. But if you miss anything and you need to go back, check it out, pause it, write things down, please do that. That's a huge benefit of this. You can kind of work at your own pace. And also there'll be questions embedded throughout as you go. Most of those questions will be application-based kind of stuff. Some might be general information, but most of those answers should be somewhere in the notes or in information that we talk about. So take your time, make sure you review those. Those will be our quiz scores, our quiz points. So take your time, make sure you do well on that, make sure you understand the information. And if you need any help as you go along, feel free to let me know, shoot me an email, anything like that. So our first topic is, what is psychology? Just the basics, history, approaches, and subfields. We're going to go over some perspectives that you'll come back to throughout the year as we apply things and we learn. These approaches will be kind of like the basis for what we discuss. So let's go ahead and get started. So the pre-scientific psychology is where we start. We're going all the way back to ancient Greece. And some of these philosophers and famous people that you might recognize. And during that time, in this era, people were still wondering why we think the way we do and why we behave the way we do. And in that sense, what is the relation of the mind to the body? And this was a question that many philosophers from that time were asking. And there were a couple different thoughts, right? Some groups thought the mind and body were connected. So you were talking like the Hebrews, Aristotle, Augustine. They thought your mind and your body worked together, right? While on the other side, you had people like Socrates, Plato, and Descartes thinking that the mind and body are distinct entities, right? The mind can work independent of the body and things like that. So there was a huge debate at the beginning of, pre-scientific psychological knowledge about which two of these groups really made the most sense. Along that same vein, they wanted to know how ideas are formed, right? Why are we thinking about what we're thinking about? How does our brain work? How does our mind work? Were some of their questions. And they were really getting into what we now know as one of the main debates of psychology, which we'll term later as nature versus nurture. But some people like Socrates and Plato believe that some ideas are inborn, right? You're born with the information that you need. We'll talk about this when we get into language, right? Some psychologists today believe that you're born with the capability to learn specific language. Others believe that the mind was a blank slate. You may have heard the term tabula rasa, coined by John Locke, if there's any history fans out there. And Aristotle, they believe, as you grow, your mind and you learn things, and nothing is inborn, right? So on this side, you have nature. We're born with certain ideas and we're going to become certain things based on our genetics. And on this side is nurture, right? We can learn and we become what we are based off of our experiences and the way that we're raised. So even back in ancient Greece, before the scientific side of psychology started to come out, there were these major debates already occurring that are still somewhat hotly debated today in psychology. So as psychology began to gain more steam, it became a little bit more science-y, I would say. And the first true psychologist was a man by the name of Wilhelm Wundt. He's known as the father of psychology because he established the first formal psychological laboratory in Leipzig, Germany. And he did that because his goal was to study consciousness, right? And you think back to those ancient Greeks. Why do we think the way we think? How does our mind work? He's asking the same questions, but he's going to have some different ideas about it. So how the elements of the mind were organized and related to one another was his study. And we call that structuralism, right? Structuralism is the how of the mind. When you think of how, you should think of how brain structures are situated and how they work together. What is the structure within our brains, right? And that was what he was thinking about and wanted to figure out. And to do this, he used a term called introspection. And introspection is the examination or investigation of your own mental processes, right? So, for example, how would he do this? He would take people into his lab and he might expose them to different stimuli, say different flashes of light or something like that. And he would ask them to describe their sensations and the experiences that they were going through. He would do this to people thousands of times just to try to standardize what was happening. And their descriptions would help him understand how, or the structure and how the elements of the mind work together to form consciousness, right? So Wilhelm Wundt, the father of psychology, and structuralism is how he began. Following Wundt was a man by the name of William James. He was the first truly American psychologist. He opened a laboratory at Harvard, and it's widely considered to be the first American psychological lab. He kind of criticized Wundt for his ideas. He thought they were a little bit too narrow and too boring. He didn't really think that knowing how the mind was structured was as important as the function of the mind and why it existed, right? So he was interested in understanding how consciousness, like thoughts and feelings, functions to help people adapt to their environments. So why does our mind behave the way it does? Not how is it structured and how do the elements work together, but why do they do what they do? He also used introspection in his efforts, but he also implemented questionnaires and more specific mental tests to try to make things a little bit more standardized and move towards that more science-y aspect, right? The scientific method, trying to prove these things so they can show actual research and evidence. As time went on, we had another psychologist. He founded what's called Gestalt psychology in revolt against Wundt and his ideals again. So he disagreed as well. But his name was Max Wertheimer, and I think he's got probably the best mustache of the three so far. But he believed that consciousness was best understood by observing whole experience rather than trying to break it down into a cluster of component elements, right? So this is best understood with the Gestalt catchphrase of the whole is greater / different than the sum of its parts, right? And we're going to see a lot of examples of this in Unit 4 in Sensation and Perception. We'll do tons of demos, but you can think of it like, I don't know if you guys will get this, but an old school movie strip that's running through a projector, right? It's actually just a bunch of single individual images on the film strip. But when you run that film strip together, the movie plays and you can understand the entire script of the film, right? But if you were to just pick out the one single images, it would be much harder to understand the whole, right? So the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and we'll look into that quite a bit in Gestalt psychology. As we continue, this is probably someone who you've heard of, Sigmund Freud. A lot of people tend to mix Sigmund Freud up with Wilhelm Wundt, thinking that Freud was the father of psychology, but that's not true. He just tends to be one of the most famous and well-known psychologists because of his outlandish ideas, right? A lot of what Freud studied and the theories he put forth are no longer accepted, but he was one of the originally most well-known psychologists. But he focused on abnormal behaviors, and that kind of what made him a little bit more well-known. And the basis of his psychoanalysis theories was that all behavior and mental processes are directed by our unconscious forces, right? Our unconscious mind, there's things below the surface of our consciousness that are directing our behavior. And Freud believed that most of those unconscious forces were sexual and aggressive urges, right? And he believed that problems in our lives arise from unresolved conflicts in our unconscious mind, right? For whatever reason, society or our defense mechanisms or things are are repressing those urges and not allowing us to express them. And that's how problems come about. So to uncover those unconscious feelings and urges, he used something called free association, which we'll do some examples of in class, and dream analysis to explore the unconscious mind, right? Getting people to just talk and speak and tell him about their dream, all of these things that he believed your unconscious mind revealed itself in, right? His ideas were and still are very controversial because they're not very scientific at all. Very hard to prove. There's not much research and evidence behind them, yet they've had a great influence on the field of psychology, and there is still a field of psych called psychodynamic that is based upon his work, which we'll get to a little bit later. So as we continue, psychology as a science, one modern branch of psychology that we scientists do really appreciate is behaviorism, because as much as Freud's was not based in science, behaviorism is the exact opposite, right? It was very popular from the 1920s to the 60s, disagreed with practically everyone in the field. J.B. Watson and B.F. Skinner, these two believe that any behavior you have can be learned and taught, right? And they believe that psychology should only study what could be observed and measured objectively. Very, very scientific in their approach. And they also insisted that solely external factors shaped behavior. So they were in that group of the tabula rasa, or the blank slate, right? They would very heavily believe in nurture, that the way you're raised and the things that you're taught as a child and throughout your life shape the way you think and the way you behave. And they didn't really give any credence to thoughts and hidden parts of the mind, like unconscious, like Freud. Not relevant, right? Only things that you can observe and see can affect our behavior. So as we move into contemporary psychology, we define psychology today as the scientific study of behavior, what we do, and mental processes, our inner thoughts and feelings. And as we mentioned at the beginning, psychology's big debate, which goes all the way back to ancient Greece, back then it was some ideas are inborn and others are a blank slate, right? Today we know that as nature versus nurture, right? The controversy over whether human traits and behaviors are based on biology, nature, or one's environment and experiences, or nurture. Right? As we move through our course, you guys will recognize that it's a little bit of a cop-out, right? Because it's a little bit of both. Right? Our genetics play a large role in the way we develop, but our environments, our nurture, who raises us, where we grow up, those environments allow certain genes to be expressed, and we learn different things in those environments. So it's a combination of both nature and nurture. It's not necessarily nature versus, but it's nature and nurture. But some of these big debates, if you think about it, is it nature or nurture? Which is the cause of psychological disorders like depression or multiple personalities? Does that have more of a nature aspect or a nurture? Sexual orientation, nature versus nurture. Our intelligence or our intellect, we're going to have a big discussion about this when we get to Unit 11. Is that nature? Is that nurture, right? Are people born smart, or are they raised and learn and grow? How about becoming a serial killer? Is there a serial killer gene, or is it the way you're raised in your environment? Right? These are all debates and things that people discuss even still today. Right? So, continuing kind of mashing things together, how we said it's both nature and nurture. We looked at some of those various approaches to psychology. The most currently accepted approach mashes a number of these together, right? Kind of like cheating. But the most currently accepted approach to psychology is something called biopsychosocial approach, right? So it mashes together your biological influences, your genetics, with Psychological influences are learned fears and other learned experiences, our emotional responses, with sociocultural factors. That's our environment, the people that we grow up around, our culture, our peer group, and they put them together to say, this is how the psychology of every person, the way they behave, their mental processes, it's a production of biopsychosocial, or behavior, mental, and cultural, right? So that's the most currently accepted approach, because it kind of encapsulates many of the approaches and puts it into one comprehensive approach. Now, that doesn't mean that these other current perspectives don't have worth, right? They investigate and look into specific aspects of psychology and kind of put forth their own theories in an effort to further the discipline. So first you have neuroscience, understanding how the brain and body create thoughts, emotions, memories, very scientific, very biological-based brain approach, right? How are messages transmitted throughout the body? We're going to talk about neurotransmitters, brain chemistry, hormones, all of those things are involved in the neuroscience aspect. Then you have the evolutionary perspective, how natural selection has caused behavior to develop and to adapt. How have people passed down behaviors or ways of thinking that would allow the species to progress and survive, right? How does evolution influence behavior tendencies? Following that, you have behavioral genetics, how much our genes and environment influence individual differences, right? So we talked about biopsychosocial. This is kind of like the first two parts, right? The way that we behave and how it's impacted by our genes, right? To what extent does our genes, our environment impact personality, intelligence, or mental disorders? This is kind of like the nature versus nurture debate, right? They analyze those things. Next up, you have psychodynamic. This is an offshoot, or another word for it would be neo-Freudians. They took the psychoanalytic approach and they updated it and gave it a new name, psychodynamic. And they tend to focus on more positive things, where Freud was abnormal psych and sexual and aggressive urges. Psychodynamic still emphasize the unconscious mind as the director of our behavior and how it motivates our actions. But they're less focused on those weird aspects or those uncommon aspects that Freud focused on. Just a few more here. So we have behavioral next, which we mentioned earlier, how our behavior is shaped by the learning processes. How do we learn to fear particular objects? How can we change problematic behaviors? When we get into this later, we'll talk about rewards and punishments and reinforcements and how those things shape our behavior and how you can use them to train humans, animals, whatever, to help them learn, right? And make associations that shape the learning process. Cognitive psychology is how we take in, store, and retrieve information. When we get to cognitive psych, we'll talk about it a little bit early on as well, but this is going to be a huge benefit for you guys in terms of studying habits and techniques, because you're going to learn more about the way our mind works and how our brain stores information and how the best to store information. Cognitive is just a fancy word for thinking. So cognitive psych is all about the way that we think. How do we use information to remember? How does interpretation impact behavior, right? How does our brain and the way that we think and perceive, how does it impact the way we behave? Next up, we have humanistic. Humanistic psychologists are very, very focused on human growth and human potential, right? This kind of comes off as like the hippie approach, right? They think that every human being wants to maximize themselves and reach self-actualization, whatever that means for them, right? How can I make myself a better person? Or there's a classic old Army commercial where they say, be all you can be, the Army National Guard, right? That's like a humanistic thing. You want to reach your full growth as a person, and everything we do should motivate us to get to that point. That's humanism. And our last one, social cultural. I'm sure you could probably guess. But human behavior must be interpreted in proper social and cultural context. So this is very nurture based, right? The society we grow up in, the culture we're raised in, impacts the way we behave and the way we think. So in this, they look at how are social influences different across cultures, right? How are various ethnic groups alike? And that tells people a lot about the psychology of certain areas of the world, the psychology of certain neighborhoods. They change because of the environment that people live and grow up in, right? Why are some mental disorders present in certain areas of the world, but they're not in others, right? That has to be something to do with the society and the culture that are there. So as we move on, we're going to get into the different subfields of psychology. And as you can see here, there's a lot of different routes that people can go in psychology, and maybe some that you never thought of, right? So this is just a number of doctorates awarded by subfield in the recent times. And we'll go over some of these, and you'll have a chance to investigate what each one of these subfields do in their daily work. So our first group of subfields is based off of what we call basic research. And basic research in psychology is just research to try to further the knowledge of the discipline, right? It's not going to be used to solve problems, but it is used to better understand human behavior and mental processes. So our first group, you could be a biological psychologist, right? You analyze the connection between the mind and the body, all the different parts of the brain, how the different chemicals interact, how the different brain structures interact to produce behavior and mental processes. Then you have developmental psychologists. They study how behavior and mental processes change over the lifespan, right? How do children develop? When do certain parts of the mind develop, and how can we begin to think in different ways? For example, when does logic develop in a child? When can they start to think analytically? How do adults think and behave compared to different ages and age groups? When does the mind fully develop? When does the brain fully develop? Those are questions that they ask and try to answer. Cognitive psychology, we talked about this earlier, but thinking, right? Studies how we perceive and how we think and solve problems, our cognition, get into IQ, things like that, how people work through problems, and generally how they think and store information. Personality investigates our persistent traits, how personality develops, what are the different traits of personality, and things like that. Whereas social psychologists explore the many ways in which people influence one another in society, right? Groupthink, group polarization. How does being in a group impact the way that we do things? That's social psychology. These all are focused on just adding information to the discipline of psychology to better understand human behavior and mental processes. And you can see that in these basic research subfields. Developmental and social are the two most popular subfields. In comparison to basic research, you have applied research. In applied research, a psychologist is going to take information that they've gained and try to solve a problem with it or use it to the betterment of society. So, industrial and organizational psychology studies and advises on behavior in the workplace, right? So this could be, if you guys have ever paid attention to the news, and maybe you know, like Google has open workspaces and they have nap pods in their building and things like that. Industrial and organizational psychologists would have worked with Google or Microsoft or whoever to design their workplaces to try to make them the most productive areas for their employees, right? So how can we make the workplace a better, more productive place? A sports psychologist works with athletes to help them maximize their performance. Let's say a basketball player is struggling with shooting free throws. or a pitcher gets the yips and he can't throw the baseball to first base. He always overthrows it, right? A sports psychologist is going to talk with them to help them get through whatever issue they're going with or maximize their performance in their specific athletic event. School psychologists, they have expertise in the problems of teaching and learning. If students are struggling with maybe certain types of assignments, or they're having problems with things like dyslexia or things like that, you can go to a school psychologist and they should be able to help develop strategies and plans for you to maybe organize yourself better, or work through your schedule, use planners, things like that are just going to help students and even teachers do their job better. Then you have counseling psychs. They help people cope with more common aspects like marital challenges, problems at work, struggling with just day-to-day aspects of life. Counseling psychologists can help develop plans, go through counseling with your partners or your family, things like that, to help you talk things out and get to a point where you think things are getting better. And finally, you have clinical psychologists who study, assess, and treat people with psychological disorders. All right, that's the big difference between counseling and clinical. Counseling is more helping with day-to-day issues and less serious issues, while clinical gets into psychological disorders. Okay? And clinical psychs, one major thing to point out, I know it says treat people here, but they do not have the power to prescribe medication, right? So how do they treat people with psychological disorders? They do what's called behavior modification. And we're going to get into talking a lot about the different strategies of behavior modification that clinical psychologists employ later in the class, right? But they cannot prescribe medication. So of these subfields, clinical psych and counseling psych are by far the largest, followed by school psych and industrial or organizational. So I just mentioned how a clinical psychologist cannot prescribe medication, right? They engage in behavior modification to try to treat people with different psychological disorders, right? On the other hand, someone who can prescribe medicine is known as a psychiatrist. They are medical doctors, MDs, right? Clinical psych are Ph.D s. They are doctors, but they're not medical doctors. Psychiatrists go through med school, and they do different rounds of specific psychiatric training, as well as general med school prep. So they are a lot more well-versed and trained in the medical side of the brain and behavior and psychology. And because of that, they are licensed to treat patients with medicine, medication, and drugs, right? As well as psychotherapy, right? So they have those behavior modifications that clinical psychologists do, but they are also allowed to prescribe drugs as well. So that kind of wraps up our first video notes. I know there's a lot of information in there, some important names, just kind of basically introducing you to the perspectives and approaches. Don't worry, in class we're going to go over some activities to apply those and differentiate them and organize them as well. So we'll get more work on it as we go. If you have any questions or anything, don't be afraid to shoot me an email or ask me in class, and we'll discuss whatever you need help with.